Alright, so hey everyone, today I want to take a look at the Deadzones for Super Meat Boy 3D. This is being demonstrated on the Xbox Series X in case it differs on other platforms. But to get into it, for movement, we have a 30% axial deadzone, so that creates a central square of no movement. And you can see that that means there's extra stick movement required to begin moving in the corners. So by default, you are limited to 8 directions, and the directions are indicated by these blue and green sections. So the blue regions are your cardinal movement, so perfectly forward, perfectly backward, perfectly to the left, and perfectly to the right. You only start seeing diagonal movement occur when you break into these green regions. Now, you pretty much are limited to 8 directions in this mode, but you do technically have 16 directions. However, the more subtle angles are within like 1% of these diagonal thresholds, so they're functionally inaccessible during normal gameplay. But something that's very easy to see is that cardinal movement is heavily prioritized. You can see the vast majority of the stick is blue, and that is the axial deadzone. Axial deadzones limit diagonal movement around the axes, and you can see that this angular threshold, or this diagonal threshold, that's actually what a separate angle threshold. So since you're limited to 8 directions, what they've done is divide the stick into 8 sections to reflect that. However, the axial deadzone limiting diagonal movement is expanding the cardinal regions on top of that to make the cardinal regions dominant. And if I trace right around the deadzone, you can really clearly see, at least at the smallest values, just how limited the diagonal range is. But they do offer options. If I go to the controls, I'm not exactly sure what this left stick sensitivity option does. It doesn't seem to control the deadzone or the angles or anything like that. So I think maybe it has something to do with the movement acceleration, though I can't easily test that, and I'm not great at perceiving that. If someone has an answer for that, please tell me in the comments. But they have given us an option to disable this 45-degree snapping. And if we do that, we can see just the 30% axial deadzone underneath it. So we have the same central 30% square deadzone. And we still have these wide cardinal restricted ranges, but we don't have the additional angular restriction ranges, so this is just the axial deadzone being present. But you can see when I exit into these diagonal regions, diagonal movement begins very subtly, so you have a full 360 degrees of movement available. However, the axial deadzone is offsetting them, so you have to break out of both axis deadzones before diagonal movement is created. And this is most obvious when, say, running into a fence. You can see that Meat Boy is perfectly locked to this because he's moving perfectly straight, but can't move any further. But if I move outside of this, you can see that he is drifting to the right because I'm moving right diagonally and then left diagonally. And there's another fence over here that we can use to look at the vertical restriction. So, turning off the snapping can be pretty nice to get more granular movements, so you're not just pivoting to the perfect 45-degree angle, and you get a little more subtlety out of this. But as far as the movement curve, it's linear, so there's just a smooth transition from your slowest possible speeds up to your maximum movement speed. And the sprint is a modifier for your speed. So if I say moving at the speed and I press the sprint button, you can see that it just sped up. And sprinting seems to be about 70% faster than your normal maximum movement. Take that number with a grain of salt. There could be error in my tests, but otherwise it also has a linear curve applied to it. It's just a straight faster version of your normal movement. And there is an option to for always sprinting, and this makes it so you don't have to hold the sprint button, and I think that's probably the ideal way to play, just so because you'll be running all the time if you want all the A+ ranks. And if you want to move slower, you can simply throttle the stick to do that. So that about covers the controls in this game. However, I have a couple of requests to improve it. The first of which is a request to change from an axial dead zone to a radial one. Switching to a radial dead zone would remove the additional restriction, which would make it so that for the snapping mode, we'd actually have a 8 divisions, 8 perfect divisions for the 8-directional movement, and for this disabled mode where 45-degree snapping is off, we'd have full and correct diagonal movement. So where we point the stick is where Meat Boy would actually go without any restriction at all. And I'm going to demonstrate what that would look like here. I'm doing this by applying an anti-dead zone. So on a separate device, I am setting up a radial dead zone. And then once that radial dead zone is broken out of, it counters the game's axial dead zone, and that functionally will flip this from an axial dead zone to a radial dead zone. So to do that, we'll do this, and so we can see now we maintain the same dead zone size, but it's now radial. And you can see that the corners now don't exist. We begin moving once we break out of the circle rather than the square. And you can see the entire graph is green, and that's because there is no restriction. If I just bob right around the horizontal axis, you can see that Meat Boy is clearly reflecting that. And if we go back to the fence to demonstrate this, you can see if I'm moving a little to the left, I'm drifting to the left, moving a little to the right, I'm drifting to the right. And we'll use this other fence to demonstrate the vertical axis. So a little to the down and a little up. And the benefit of this is that Meat Boy will now go in the exact direction you point him, and this can feel really great to make very subtle diagonal movements. you can see that if I just snake a little bit, that's reflected quite easily. Just moving straight around the axis. And this is beneficial because, at least with significant angular restriction, like with the default axial dead zone, if you want to make a diagonal correction, you have to make a pretty dramatic movement with the stick, and that can make under and overshooting a little more common. If you don't move the stick far enough, you'll still move perfectly straight or in a cardinal direction, and if you move too far, you might make a more abrupt angle than you want. Whereas with full diagonal movement, you point the stick in direction, and Meat Boy will always reflect that direction directly. And if you make a correction, that will always be reflected. There's no dead zone that you have to guess where the threshold is before that begins transitioning. But to look at how the 45-degree snapping would change, we can see that we still have that 30% radial dead zone now. However, the cardinal regions are now exactly the same size as the diagonal regions, so they're completely equal to the diagonal regions. And if we trace the dead zone, you can see that quite clearly, whereas before, diagonal movement was a very thin point. Just across the entire stick magnitude, we have an even distribution of cardinal and diagonal directions. But to, again, remove 45-degree snapping and looking back at this, so again, we're back at full diagonal movement. So Meat Boy is moving in the exact direction we point the stick. So I've mentioned that this can feel very good to make very subtle angles. However, some players may not like this because they want some extra guidance to make perfectly cardinal movements. And that's another thing I'd like to request is an option to control the level of restriction. So we see an idealized version of how to restrict with the 45-degree angle snapping. It's restricting by the angle, and we've seen broadly 30% of the stick restricted with the default axial dead zone. So I'll demonstrate what 15% restriction looks like. So you can see that, again, we still have the radial dead zone applied, but we do have some level of restriction here. So 15% around this axis is restricted. And if we go to this fence, you can see that I can move the stick within this region, and Meat Boy is locked perfectly downward. But if I break out of this, he begins moving diagonally. So having an option to control the level of restriction would allow players to customize this to suit their preference. So players that want full and correct diagonal movement can completely disable the restriction, and players who want a lot could increase it. So the way the sliders for all the options seem to work is they're all 10-step increments, so from 0 to 10. And so a slider for the level of angular restriction would be requested. The exact range doesn't matter too much, but definitely from 0 to at least the default 30, and 30 could remain the default for players that have been playing since launch and want to maintain that can keep that level of restriction without being bothered by that. Or it can go even further. For example, dividing the stick into 8 regions would be about 41% restriction. So I could go up to that to get 45 degrees of restriction. So the exact maximum doesn't matter, but 30 can be the default, whatever actual maximum it is, but just as long as the slider can go down to 0, this would give players a ton of granular control over the level of restriction that they have. But that about covers it. The only other potential option to add would be the Deadzone. So we have a 30% Deadzone here, which is quite large. And since most of the time you're going to be moving the stick fully, there's no real major reason to use smaller Deadzone sizes, but it could be useful for those smaller Deadzones. Could be useful if you want to make small adjustments a little more easily. But increasing the Deadzone is always useful for players with extremely worn sticks who may get some unwanted drift. Though this would have to be pretty dramatic, and with the curve probably wouldn't be too significant. But it's always nice to have. But just to summarize things, so switching from a axial Deadzone to a radial Deadzone would correct the default snapping mode and have it be properly divided into 8 segments. For the disabled snapping mode, you'd be able to get full diagonal movement, and with an option available for the level of restriction, that would allow players to customize the exact level of restriction they want. And then potential Deadzone option. The Deadzone option, could range from say 0 to 50%, and with 10 step increments, each Deadzone step could be 5% or something. So that's enough rambling from me. Hopefully these changes can be considered. This game is pretty awesome, and hopefully if these options are considered, it will make the controls as perfect as they can be. So yeah, that's it. Thanks for watching, and everyone, have a great rest of your day.